Hello everyone, welcome to Instagram Live.
I thought I was the one that couldn't speak this week.
Yeah, welcome to Instagram Live, episode 11 with Max and Elijah. This week we are going to be talking about Prop 21. Prop 21 would be a very bad proposition if it passes, both in the short and the long term for people in California. We're going to explain to you why we're voting no on Prop 21 and encourage you to look into the proposition and make a decision for yourself.
Take us away, Elijah.
All right, where would you like to go?
So, we'll talk a little bit about like what Prop 21 is and its intentions of what it's going to change regarding like regulations here in California. And New York passed something similar, and I want to preface that New York showed that this is something that can pass, can go into effect, and can really hurt not just real estate, but economic factors and people's livelihood in that city. And what Prop 21 is, in 2018 there was a Prop 10. Prop 21 is very similar, where they want to repeal Costa-Hawkins. Costa-Hawkins was something passed in the 90s that basically locked in rent control. Back then it was changing. Cities were just changing it as things came up, and then it locked in rent control laws. Well, now the government wants to repeal Costa-Hawkins so that cities can now implement their own rent control laws, new rent control laws, change it to whatever they feel like is appropriate. And the reason behind it is they feel that affordable housing, there's an extreme shortage of affordable housing, and that the cost of living in Los Angeles and California as a whole is just way too high. So their measure to address this issue is, well, let's make stricter rent control laws. It's the owners that are at fault. It's not the system and the economic environment that's the problem. And so it's definitely, as Elijah said, can cause a lot of detriment to owners, to the economy, to tenants, to buildings. There's so many drawbacks to this. I do see like the mentality, the pros behind it, but I think the pros don't account for what the drawbacks are and what's going to happen if it does pass.
And I think the pros could help out a small number of people for a short period of time. But in the long run, if you have something that's not sustainable, if you look at the financial crisis that we had in 2008, 2009, so it helped a lot of people in a short period of time, but over a long period of time, it actually hurt a lot more people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the case with any system that's put in place that does not make sense. Okay, you can't give money to people, you can't give someone a loan for $1 million if their house is worth $500,000. That system doesn't work. Very simple, doesn't work. So I think you got to take a broad stroke, bird's eye view as to what is the proposition on a practical basis, what's going to happen as a result, and then work your way back into, well, am I pro or against it? And we can start with the pros just to show kind of the thought process behind, I don't think either of us really feel that the people who are behind the Prop 21 are necessarily, bad or have bad intentions whatsoever. I think they just don't realize what the long-term results are. Now, I could be wrong about that, I could be right, who knows? But the point is that there are some theoretical pros, which is that your landlord can't raise the rent when you move out of your apartment. So the next person who's going to get your apartment is going to pay roughly the same amount of money. If you're living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Beverly Hills now, and you're paying $1,000 a month because you've been grandfathered in for 30, 40 years, the next person who's going to come in, the landlord's only going to be able to charge $1,000 plus incremental increase. And that could be good theoretically for that new renter who's coming in. However, what do you think is going to really happen? Do you think that person who has a $1,000 apartment in Beverly Hills that's worth $3,500, do you think that person is going to really just walk away from that apartment, or do you think they're going to try to figure out a way to monetize it? Are they going to try to sublet? Are they going to try to sell the tenancy? Are they going to leave it for their children as a legacy? What's really going to happen? What's the net result on a practical basis?
Yeah, and the other pro that I see though is let's say they do move out, right? and the landlord has to go to market to rent it out, and now can only rent it out for 5, 10, 15% higher. Well, that's going to change what market rent is. If that's the comp now, if the comp is like, hey, I can rent out this unit for $1,100, and we have a brand new building that we just built and we're asking $4,000 for the unit, well, there's no way we're ever going to get $4,000. And so the pro that I see is like, yeah, it can drop the rental market, right? The pricing of a rental unit. But as Elijah said, are there going to be available units? And I also think that owners, like the con to this is owners will say, hey, I have a vacancy. I'll rent it out to my 2 friends because maybe I won't get $4,000. I'll get $3,200 or $3,500, but that's a whole heck of a lot better than the $1,100 I'm going to get. So there may be a majority of units that don't even hit the rental market because owners say, I'm just rent it out to somebody I know. Or maybe I'll hold it vacant in hopes maybe 2 years down the road, they'll repeal this, they'll change it, they'll modify it, they'll get rid of the vacancy control aspect. And if I get locked into a tenant at a super low rent, they may stay for 30 years. So the opportunity cost of them holding it long term, it makes sense to hold it vacant for 2 years.
What are the other pros? What do we write down for pros? So some tenants can benefit from basically, giving it to their children or, leaving as an inheritance essentially. If they have a relative move in, and they can try to pass down the unit, which happens in New York all the time. I don't really see any other pros. I mean, I can conceive why people can say, hey, it's, the rents are going to stay low, but in reality, what's going to happen? What is realistically going to happen? So I think to understand this, you have to understand two things: basic economics, supply and demand, and also investor appetite, right? And just how investors think. And it's very understandable that people that are not in the investment space are not going to understand both of these things, and that's why you can have politicians that will try to institute things that don't make economic sense or sense for investors or the people at large. But the first thing is supply and demand. So when it comes to the supply, how much supply is there going to be if there's vacancy control? Well, you're disincentivizing builders to build more because they're going to say, why should I build something if I can't rent it out at a fair market rate? You're going to have people who are going to buy, someone may buy a 10-unit apartment building in Beverly Hills, let's just use that example, and they're going to say, well, the 10-unit apartment building, it's worth more as land because I can knock it down and then build a big house, and that's going to be very valuable, or I can knock it down and build for sale condos, and that's going to be very valuable. So rental housing is going to be lessened. There's going to be less rental housing. What else, Max?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go back to your first point that there's not an incentive to build, and why is somebody's going to build and say, hey, this is the amount of money I'm going to make, whether it's the building's going to be worth this or this is going to be my cash flow. But the cost of land and the cost of construction, your return just doesn't justify.
Almost spilled my water.
Instagram Live almost ended. The cost of all that, the income that you're going to get does not justify building. So then so there's just nobody's going to build. There's going to be no new supply, and I think that's the problem is, and I want to focus on this aspect is like we don't disagree that there is a housing problem, an affordable housing problem in Los Angeles, but it's not a rent control issue. You look at states, cities that don't have rent control, they have affordable housing. They have people that are making income and their rents are justified. There's that balance. The problem here is you don't have the supply to support affordable housing. And maybe, you said this earlier, so I'm going to steal your line, is if the government was incentivizing developers to build affordable housing, help pay for the cost, or help pay the higher rent so that the costs are justified, that's a solution. A productive solution where there's a meeting of the minds and everybody comes out ahead, everybody wins.
Right. Another solution would be to upzone. So take parts of LA or parts of California for that matter and look at the zoning, and you may have R1 zoning, R2 zoning, which means that you can only build a single family, maybe you could build a duplex and make it R3, R4, R5 and let people build up. Now obviously you have neighborhood councils who are going to be against this, opposition. But at the end of the day, we want to be solution oriented and focus on, hey, what's really going to help bring rents down, bring the cost of living down. It's an increased supply, which comes back to this broad stroke of increased supply versus demand. So how are you going to increase the supply in order to satiate the demand? You're going to incentivize builders. You're going to give them either tax breaks, tax incentives. You're going to give them funding to build. You're going to upzone neighborhoods so that people can build more, so that the numbers, it pencils. Look, to build, even for us, when we renovate. I mean, sometimes our renovation jobs can take 12, 18, 24 months, depending on the scope of work and what we're doing. But these projects can take a year, 2 years sometimes. So, and to build is no different. It could take a year, 2 years, 3 years. It depends on the scope of the project and what you're building. So, and during that process, it's not like, oh, I'm just going to wait and everything's going to happen. It's a lot of work, energy, time, and money that goes into building something. And if you want people to do that, and you want them to increase the supply of housing, then there needs to be a reasonable return on their investment. There needs to be an incentive, because otherwise, why do it if there's no return? I can do a lot of other things to make money. If I'm going to be building, it's got to be in order to make money one way or the other.
Yeah, and I want to focus too on the investor aspect, and let me run through this scenario, and I think it will make sense. Is, let's say I bought a building 4 years ago. I bought it for $2 million. The rents are X.
Wish I would have known you then.
There's a tenant in that building. Let's say they're renting out a 2-bedroom for $2,000. Well, now there's vacancy control. They say, hey, I can go rent out a comparable unit for $1,600. So I'm going to move. So now I bought the building on the premise. I'm getting $2,000 for that unit, probably for all the units. Now that tenant leaves. Now I can only get $1,600. And I also bought the building because, hey, maybe there's upside, right? It's worth $2 million today. Well, as the rents go up, people move, I renovate, make it nicer. It could be worth $2.5, $3 million. But now if there's vacancy control, there's no upside. So somebody who's going to buy it for me is buying strictly on cash flow today, what is that cash flow today? What if those tenants move and the rents go down? So I bought it for $2 million. We saw this in New York. There was a 30-40% decrease in pricing for all these factors. So now my building, somebody's going to come in and pay $1.5 million.
So what you're saying essentially is that property values are going to come down, and what that's going to mean is that people are going to go to the county tax assessor and they're going to say, hey, I bought this property for $2 million. I pay $22,000, $23,000 a year in property tax. Now it's worth $1 million, right? Because the property value has gone down $1 million. So now my property is worth $1 million. I'm not paying you $25,000 a year in property tax. I'm going to pay you $12,000, $13,000 because it's based on the assessed value. The assessed value has come down. Same, similar conversation we had last week about Prop 15. But the point is that you're going to reduce people's property value. They're going to pay less money in property taxes, and thereby reducing the revenue for the government. The government's going to have less money. They're not going to be able to fix the roads. They're not going to be able to do all the things that they do with property tax money. And is it going to be a great place to live? I don't think so.
Yeah. And then what happens to the banks that have these loans? Right? That's like a whole other issue, all the debt that's out there. It's scary. It's scary to think about what happens if this passes and property values decrease, income decreases, taxes decrease. I think there's so many repercussions that on the surface, okay, more affordable housing, that sounds great. But is this the right solution? And we feel like it's not. The drawbacks, the consequences of if Prop 21 passes and vacancy control gets implemented, they're just too drastic to support.
Let me ask you something. When you drive down the street and you see properties, who owns those properties, right? And forget about properties. You're walking on the sidewalk. You're driving on the street. Who owns those? Who owns that street? Who owns all the properties? I'll tell you who they're owned by. It's either government owned or it's private owned. If government has less money to upkeep because the property taxes go down, and that's a significant portion of the funding, right, for the state, city, local levels. If that funding goes down, who is going to pay, right? Something's got to give. Either the place is going to look like shit, excuse my French, right? No, but seriously, it's going to look like terrible, okay? Or they're going to have to make up for it some way or another. Either a sales tax, something's got to give in order to create funding to make the city look normal, decent, okay? And the other properties that you look at are owned by private investors. A private investor who can't raise rents has zero to very little reason to upkeep the property. If they have deferred maintenance, why should I paint the building if I can't raise the rents?
Yeah.
Why should I fix the plumbing? Why should I do anything if I can't make a return on my investment? I'd rather just sell it and move the money to Texas. I'd rather sell it and move the money to Florida. I'd rather sell it and buy something else. Maybe buy an office building. Maybe buy a medical office. So the question is, if you're driving down the street and you see that there's buildings that are decrepit because Prop 21 passed, well, it's not because the landlord's a bad person. It's because why should someone make a capital investment? Why should someone take money out of their bank account, out of their pocket, and pay for something that's going to improve the quality of the entire neighborhood by beautifying their property if they don't see any return on that
Always
investment?
negative return.
Exactly.
And somebody asked about, what property we're talking about. We're talking more in a general sense, right? What's going to happen to the economy and the real estate market as a whole. So not anything in particular, but I think it applies to every single property. And that's the problem. It doesn't, single family homes, I think they took it out. They first wanted to put it in, they took it out. So, single family homes, and there's certain situations that it won't apply to people, but it applies to, all parts of the real estate market. So, and that's what's scary.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining. We were talking about Prop 21. I saw Tovio was asking which proposition we're talking about. I'll make a proposition to you. How about you start from the beginning, watch the whole thing. You can see which proposition we're talking about. But it is, I meant which proposition. Yes, Prop 21, Proposition 21. I think we had a few other questions. How do you zoom through? I'm not good with technology.
Somebody asked what like election, what happens if Trump loses and Biden goes into office. I think that's like a whole other topic.
Yeah.
There are some scary things with what he's proposing, 1031 exchanges, but maybe
we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah.
Tune in
after the election.
Yeah. Tune in every other Thursday. Yep. So not next Thursday, but the following 5:30 p.m. for TGG, the Goldfinger Group. Max, Elijah, thank you for coming. Thank you for leaving.